Hi, my name is Nancy Lowe. I'm an archivist, a librarian, and a genealogist, and I've been in this field for more than 40 years at this point, which I think is one of the reasons why I might have been asked to deliver the keynote address to you all today. It actually was a very interesting experience to reflect on the changes that have happened just in that amount of time and the progress that we're making as we learn to work together. When I began my first professional job right out of library school was a genealogy department in a public library. And of course, everything in those days was analog and on paper. And later in my career at a university, if I wanted to seriously freak my students out, I would tell them I went to library school before the internet. And they almost couldn't conceive of that. So let's go ahead and dive in. I am delighted to be able to share my thoughts with you. I only wish we could be doing this in person. So the title of my speech today comes from a journal article I found that was addressing an antipathy that has at one time existed between archivists and librarians and genealogists. And so I think it's useful for us to first acknowledge and then think about why this came to be, and then eventually we can keep improving the situation. So I think this particular journal article in 1993 in the archival literature was right on the money when they said there was a traditionally negative view of archivists toward genealogists. And from this remove, it seems almost inconceivable to me that so many value judgments were being made about genealogists and the legitimacy of their work and claim on staff time. So I thought I would take a look at the origins of this particular culture, which I consider the Dark Ages. I think eventually it moved into a period of what that writer called peaceful coexistence. And then I'd like to finish today by talking about how we are working together and how we can continue to do so. So it is quite true, and this particular article has a novel excuse for why archivists would somehow look down upon genealogists. Again, it may seem baffling to those of you who have joined the profession relatively recently or taken up genealogy relatively recently, because again, it just seems almost inconceivable that you could make a value judgment about users. So I wanted to know how far back this culture went and how it arose. And so again, I looked through the literature, and I am going to use their actual words. So here are some quotes that I found. Genealogy is pleasant and harmless. It's something to be humored, but it's ultimately of no importance because it's not about distinguished persons, and therefore it is excluded from the world of scholarship. I wish I could tell you that this is now a relatively rare opinion, but I think especially within the history profession, this attitude prevails. In the New York Times in 2018, in the op-ed page, this particular historian, first of all, set it up as if it's an adversarial relationship from the very beginning. And he, of course, you might realize after he finished his most recent book, he discovered he was distantly related to one of the people in his book. And so, of course, he instantly thinks he has to defend himself, but he can absolve his interest because she was a genuine historical figure. I also, P.S., would say he's never talked to any genealogists because I've never, ever heard them say one of ours when they found an ancestor. And so his big conclusion is probably the part that depresses me the most. The whole idea that history and genealogy are somehow exclusive of each other is parochial, I think. And his notion that history is, of course, what historians tell us is valuable and which people had value in the past. And then from that, they say this matters. But of course, a poor genealogist is only ever going to be self-interested. I reject this. I think that history and genealogy matter together. After a while, it became almost laughable to find so many harshly expressed opinions about genealogy researchers. So I'm going to distill what I found in the literature. It's the genealogists who are being parochial, they're amateurs, unskilled, demanding, narrow, waspy was another one. And the useful idiots came from a social historian who said, oh, there's so much value in all of these genealogy records. So, you know, thanks for getting all those together. And by the way, I made something that's real social history using genealogy records. So this kind of division, to me, had to have some kind of reason. And so I took a look at where this mutual discontent arose, and I am going to use the word roots. And I think there are 4 areas that are worth exploring today. On the right, we have the founding members of the American Association of Historians. Sorry, the American Historical Association. I think they're probably going to rise up and from their graves and try to find me for that mistake. So let's talk about how professions were beginning to emerge in the last decades of the 19th century. You have the first library school opening at Columbia in 1887. You have the formation of the American Historical Association in 1884, which became a very important almost lobbying group, but professional association for academic historians who were only at this point beginning to establish themselves as a discipline. Before this time, both of these professions were really just the province of the gentleman scholar, if you will. And so what of archivists? In 1895, AHA appointed the Historical Manuscripts Commission, but they didn't, of course, appoint any archivists. And so really the whole nature of how archives were defined, how they were managed, how they were used, came under the purview of academic historians. And unfortunately, at the turn of the century, the historiography was based on the Germanic notion of the great man in history. I say unfortunate because I think it has reverberations even to this day, that somehow history can only be about famous or important people. So the great man theory is literally what it says. You can encapsulate the whole history of the world just by studying the lives of great men. At the same time, institutions are emerging along with these professions. And of course, Thomas Jefferson sold his library collection to Library of Congress in 1800, so a bit of a head start there. The first state archives technically was in California in 1850, but actually arose in 1901 in Alabama and other southern states who were interested in preserving ideals and materials about the Confederacy. And then you see, relatively late to the game, the National Archives being founded in 1934. And because of that founding, there was a new examination of what kind of skills and abilities someone would need to have to be working in an archives. So as we saw, 1887, 1884, it isn't until 1936 that the Society of American Archivists is formed as a professional organization for those of us working in archives. Part of the reason for this examination of what it took to be an archivist and how one qualified to be an archivist was the fact that the National Archives building downtown, I love this photo of it under construction, and clock that citation. We don't make it easy, do we? But it was time to begin to codify what skills and abilities people should have to work in an archives. And so Samuel F. Bemis is appointed to undertake this kind of assessment of what kind of training archivists needed. And as you can see, exalted positions, I want you to find your director today and let that person know how exalted they are. Who needs this training to be a first class or a director of a major archives, a doctorate in American history? So again, we see academic historians influencing how archives are formed and managed. And then fortunately, someone has to be in the stacks doing all the work, and conveniently Bemis decided there would be a second class of archivists, and just a master's degree in social science is fine, and support in library technique, which is odd because there wasn't really a lot of overlap at that point between libraries and archives in terms of professional training. And so who begins to manage these institutions that have come to the fore? And the answer is, it took until 2016 before the Librarian of Congress, the director, had a library degree. And at the National Archives, a tad earlier, the first professional archivist of the United States was appointed in 2009. Before this time, they were professional historians, usually noted authors, scholars of great renown and ability, but not exactly the people who were day-to-day developing collections, preparing them for use. So what starts to happen to break up this whole notion of academic historians as the arbiter of what history is, what is worthwhile to collect, preserve, and provide access to, what is worthwhile to write about and to teach? And that is a new discipline, a new theory in historiography. And when it first came out and I was studying in the late 70s, it was called the New Social History. Of course, now it's just social history, but it really was about a wholesale rejection of the great man theory, and that you only needed to study famous people. So when that happened, this amazing shift happened along with it. Scholars who were interested in social history, the lives of everyday people, suddenly realized that they could use census, vital records, genealogies, county histories to draw their conclusions and write about the past. all the materials that genealogists had been saving, indexing, preserving, and compiling suddenly had scholarly value because of this change and trend toward social history. At the same time, I think you see an increasing professionalization of librarians and archivists and their positions. You see within the public a great deal of interest in centennial commemorations in the 1960s regarding the Civil War. Public history and the notion of those everyday people being engaged in history really took off during the bicentennial. Yes, they were still relying on the great man in history theory, and there was just an unbelievable amount of material that I'll be nice and call it popular culture or kitsch. That's probably a good word too. So there was this public gaze that turned back to the past, and history assumed new importance. But then probably the biggest development that brought genealogy to the forefront was Roots. It was a 12-hour mini-series over a week, broadcast on consecutive nights, which was quite rare. And 130 to 140 million viewers watched this show. These are numbers that we no longer see for any kind of broadcast or cable for that matter. Alex Haley's book, Roots, that this was based on, I believe he sold 14 or 15 million copies. So in a week, 10 times more people were exposed to this important shift in perspective for history. The whole notion that you could begin writing about Roots by comparing it to Rich Man, Poor Man, or Upstairs, Downstairs, because it was a mini-series, I think melted away pretty quickly, because this really was the first time that the institution of slavery was examined in a popular medium. So as a consequence of Roots, the visits to libraries and archives skyrocketed. It's very hard to overstate how overwhelming all of this is. I happen to be finishing up my graduate degrees, and I had a thesis to finish, and where I used to go down to the National Archives and walk in and pick a microfilm reader, suddenly there was a line of people around the block to wait to get in, time limits on readers. It was a tsunami of interest that drove people to libraries and archives. And it is important to remember in 1977 that the world of research was published books, microforms, and if you wanted to do international genealogical research, you wrote a letter. It cost 25 cents to send a letter to Europe, and then you sat and waited for a reply. There was one person on my staff in the genealogy library that I was running, and all she did was order microfilm for our users from the National Archives unit in Denver. You also could apply to see other years. In fact, you can still do this today if you have a legitimate reason, but everything was form driven, a lot of typing, a lot of mailing. It was just unbearably slow. And that's not good when you have lines around the block. I remember coming to work for months, probably a couple of years, and there would always be people waiting to get into the genealogy department. And so I think within the profession itself, both libraries and archives, we know they're underfunded. We know they're understaffed. In terms of genealogical research, I would say many were undertrained, but the one thing for certain is these staff members were overwhelmed. And so I think this is where one of those entrenched notions that genealogists are just a source of frustration really started to take on a life of its own. Even when they went to archives, and they did a lot of news coverage about these waves of people visiting libraries and archives to do their family history, even then, these researchers are framed as if they're a problem, which is obviously not the way to greet people. And the whole notion that 90% of them come in with no idea of what we have. Well, of course not. It just, again, to me is astounding that these adversarial relationships are the frame and the lens that are used. Even today, in the professional literature, it's like, well, if you're going to work with genealogists, this is what they do. They come in and ask for the list with all the names. And actually, one day during the tsunami after Roots, we had someone come in. I was on the reference desk, and he yanked the drawer out of the card catalog, a physical catalog, and he came over and he said, "My name is not in here." And I said, "Did you write a book?" And he said, "No, I'm here to do my roots." And I said, "All right, we can get you started. Here are, some pedigree charts, and here's Everton's." And he said, "No, no, no, you don't understand. I'm here for my roots." And I said, "Yeah, we'll get you set up right away." And he goes, "I'm at the 20-minute parking meter. So, where are my roots?" These are the kind of people who might have been a source of laughter in a break room, but they also went away and didn't come back. Their interest was very surface, but the issue becomes how to work effectively with those new library and archival users. And as you might imagine, and it's hard to believe, but before Roots took on, it was very rare to have an orientation packet or some kind of material that you could greet new users with. The notion that you would give tours on a regular basis or classes in how to use collections. Partnerships with other genealogical libraries was essential. We also learned that society, founding societies, creating community, it was not just a source of volunteers and funding, but it also helped build skills. It helped people be more effective users. And so everything about this really was the painful transition in some places between librarians and archivists seeing genealogists as a problem and shifting to thinking about what the user experience was like. So in my genealogy department, we had a brochure. It was our first. You can tell this is the 70s because we have a Harvest Gold brochure. We also have a teeny weeny tiny type. And as an older genealogist now, let me tell you, this would be much bigger type and much fewer words. But the notion that that we were there to help, I think, was the number one thing that we wanted to encourage. And we did found a society. I began to teach, and some of the other members of my staff eventually pitched in, and we taught in a lot of different venues at community colleges, formal classes, adult education, all those kinds of things. Those, of course, also were the days when you just needed 2 books to learn how to get started. And my own dirty little secret at the time was that I had never done genealogy. And I had all of 8 of my great-grandparents were immigrants. And so it was like, if I am going to effectively help people, if I'm going to teach them research principles, which to me do not vary according to discipline, but if I'm going to be doing this, I need to do my own family history. And this is my pitiful first attempt to figure out just who my ancestors were. And I have to say, you know, I'm an archivist when I can come up with a pedigree chart from 40 years ago. So the other thing we did was form a society. And again, it was nice to have a source of funds. It was wonderful for them to, you know, have some autonomy and meet together. It also relieved some of the pressure on staff because they had other people to talk to as they were not just doing their research, but the results. And we created a forum. And it's nice to see that even 40 years later, I went last year and celebrated with them over Zoom because that organization is still going, and that's nice to see. So then computers start creeping in, and things like Time Magazine are so helpful. Thanks to the computer, genealogy is as easy as 1, 2, 3. The notion that before, if the National Archivists were upset because people wanted their dossiers, then this time it was, I think, a speeding up of that process. And I have to say, I felt at times, especially as the whole idea of Amazon streaming, instant delivery of whatever it is that you were craving, crept into the research process. And so there were days where it felt like all you were doing was serving fast food. But even again, when you look at the literature from that time, there's still a lot of judging going on. And so this particular person draws the conclusion that historians are annoying too. Which again, I don't think is the way that we want to approach things. So really the goal is how we work together and what kind of conversations we're having in the archives today. I think it's absolutely a really wonderful development that we have moved beyond this notion of peaceful coexistence or tolerance. And one of the reasons why is, again, there's still this, I think, almost fear of genealogy researchers for those in information professions who haven't done this kind of research. But you also see it shifting. There's a pronounced shift where genealogy enters the literature in terms of understanding what users, their satisfaction levels, what is their user experience like, how can you build collections and provide services. And so today, what I have discovered is that genealogists are, first of all, increasingly sophisticated. This is not in any remote stretch people coming in and saying, I'm at the 20-minute parking meter, so give me my roots. These are people who, the ones who stay with us, understand that it's a process, and the journey, again, is as valuable as the destination. They are intent on managing and improving and building research skills. They're interested in information management. In fact, this is these are presentations that I do all the time. And I think we may have done an excellent job of sharing how to do research. What we have not done as good a job on is helping people manage their own family archives. Genealogists today understand standards and best practices. There's a certification process too here and in other countries. They're also the most persistent researchers. Having worked with college students, especially in, let's say, the last 20 years, there's this kind of shock and horror that you don't go to a computer to find the answer to the thing that you need instantly. Confronted with, microfiche or a reader, it's really almost a sense of panic. So in my experience, genealogists will go through just about anything, including miles of microforms or whatever outmoded format the information they need happens to be on. The other thing that I think has happened is it's broadened far beyond those original days. When I would unlock the door in that genealogy library 40 years ago, it was mostly older white people, and they nearly all were interested in lineage associations like the DAR and the Mayflower. In fact, it was difficult for me to do my own research at that time because there really weren't a lot of good European resources, and my family had come to the country relatively recently. So obviously Europe has been a huge focus for many years, but now we're seeing a broadening out to include Asia, South America, Central America. They're also resourceful in my experience, and they're very welcoming of others. And this notion of how genealogists have used those societies and replicated them online from social media produces this feeling of community. And was it Wayne Gretzky always said, you need to skate to where the puck will be instead of where it is. And so if archivists and genealogists are to continue cooperating, we need to meet them where they are. And increasingly they are online and on social media. So what's the good news? When I look at the work that we could still be doing to improve access and collections and services for genealogists, I think first about community. And increasingly, again, I think community is not just people, it's the records. And together they make what these two archivists thought of as a community of records. The ways in which genealogists reuse, combine, interpret, disseminate records to create a coherent narrative. There's just this little gotcha at the end about how it gives added meaning to their own lives. Of course it does, but I think again, it has a larger importance. The next idea I think that we continue to work on is the notion of sharing our profession. And when we do it, to drop as much of the lingo and archive speak as we possibly can. As I was working on this presentation, this was one section of a professional newsletter that I get. And I tried to read this and I tried to read it again, and then I gave up. And I was really glad that I'm not an audiovisual archivist, because I don't know what they're talking about. And if we don't know, how can we ever communicate? When I'm teaching genealogists how to catalog their family photos, I usually use this slide. And I do it for two reasons. The first is, yes, there is this much work, the schemas, the crosswalks, all of the processing that goes into delivering a digital item. And so that notion that somehow genealogy should be free and we're all just a bunch of grumpy party poopers because we don't share our records, I think we need to do a better job of communicating exactly what goes into first acquiring, processing, and certainly digitizing collections for use. The other thing is that it really isn't anything that genealogists have to know in order to do good work. But I do think that we pull out key ideas and share those as much as we can. And one of them is metadata. And when I do teach this at conferences or seminars, there's a real interest in understanding how archives work and how they can make their own personal archives work as well. So I believe that there is still some trepidation when genealogists would like to use archival collections for research. It's certainly not as clear as the libraries that they grew up with in their schooling. So again, it becomes our job, I think, to communicate as effectively as we can how we provide intellectual access to collections. One of my really popular presentations is just about the wealth of information that lies outside the walled gardens of the big commercial subscription companies like Ancestry and Find My Past. People are amazed and pleased, of course, to discover that there is so much material. But I think, again, basics are so important. I think there's confusion among genealogists and lay people about the difference between archives collections, library collections, and museums. And so this is one of the, I think, prized handouts because it encapsulates what the differences are, and again, what you need to know as a genealogist to find information. There's also, I think, a genuine interest in how collections are processed. Personally, this was always my favorite part of my job. The whole notion that you could take this and turn it into this and then see people using it, to me, was wonderful. And especially those of you working in the Utah State Archives and records management fields, you know, it's a river of paper today. It's a river of pixels as well. So it was as close, I think, as you could get to, say, a carpenter who would start with some nails and lumber and work away, and by the time he or she was done, they had a table. So there's genuine interest about behind the scenes at the archives. Another key concept I think it's important for genealogists to understand is the notion of intellectual access, because let's face it, that's our job one. Yes, we understand that we're here to acquire and preserve, but until we process, the value is not there. And so that means helping people understand finding aids and not just this, where's my digitized record? Portals are, I think, are a fairly unknown concept. And so when I speak, and I've heard other archivists, spending a lot of time helping them understand that there are these gateways, in essence, to both print and digital and primary and secondary sources, and that we are working in order to make these collections accessible for them. There's also, I think, a real need to understand the deep web. Everyone today with a pulse understands the big search engines and how they're skimming the surface of the internet. What is less well understood, and this is where our values lie, this is where our collections lie, is this wonderful deep web and the ways in which you can access this material. And then, of course, there's some concern usually about the dark web, but that dissipates fairly quickly because you start showing them all the great stuff that they could find. Another set of concepts that I think are absolutely invaluable for genealogists is the notion of a finding aid, descriptive guide, collection guide, calendar, register, whatever you want to talk. or call any kind of intellectual access into your collections. And so the notion that in order to even process collections, you would do some genealogy research as an archivist is one that I think is reassuring to people. And they're very pleasantly surprised at the depth and scope of finding aids for major collections. And anything that will help them get, yes, to the container or folder or whatever it is they need, but understanding all the work that goes into making these collections accessible. And so the third and final place that I think continues to need attention is the notion of inclusion, diversity, representation, however you would like to call it. We not only need to make sure that we are reaching out to genealogists of color, but we also are creating opportunities and championing those teachers in the profession of color, those genealogists who professionally share their information. You may start hearing about American descendants of slavery. This, I think, is an increasing focus. And this particular writer in 2019 pointed out the thing that I noticed in 1977. Here was this book and mini-series about slavery, about families and how they persist or not over time. But it became this, this ocean wave of white older researchers. So anything that we can do to broaden collections and help preserve a more complete picture of the past, I think is phenomenal. 4 million new records from the Freedmen's Bureau just released. New digital libraries. This one is, I think, at the University of North Carolina. This is a collection at the Library of Congress, also just released, completely free to use. This was a Black photographer who worked in Washington, D.C. And again, it's a more complete picture of the past. You see a lot of middle-class African-American families who lived in the district and were photographed. And I think we're, especially Family Search, I give them so much credit. They teach about records in other languages. There's definitely a push, a drive to make sure that they're documenting people from all over the world. So we're going to see much more, I think, Latino, certainly Asian genealogy. The last time I went to SLIG, there was a class on Chinese genealogy, which I think is fabulous. So there are all kinds of records to be collected, to be processed, to be shared. And the way to do that is to make sure that we think of the community of records and people, that we are as forthcoming about what goes into maintaining collections of primary sources in archives, and that we are including everyone and making the palette full color. I think I maybe need to work on the concept here if the acronym turns out to be CSI, but my feelings, I believe, are shared by many archivists, most archivists. And so that always leads me, and I get this question frequently, why do we do this? Why do we preserve archives? Why do we make sure that they're accessible? Why are we genealogists? And there's a book called Time and Again, and it's a time travel novel. And in this book, he says, I've always felt a wonder at old photographs, not easy to explain. Knowing that what you're seeing was once real, that these people were really there once, smiling into a camera. You could have walked into that scene then and touched those people and spoken to them. You could actually have gone inside that strange outmoded building and seen what now you never can, what was just inside the door. That's why I do this. I suspect that's why you do this. And I know it's why genealogists do this. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak today and gather my thoughts on the last 40 years in the profession. Please come and visit me on the web. I always love hearing from fellow archivists and genealogists, and I always have ideas and opinions. So I have a blog, a newsletter, some ebooks, presentations. In every case, I think things are so much better and the skies ahead are very bright as well. So thank you for your time today.
Hi, my name is Robert Birch. I am the Executive Director of Sema Hadithi African American Heritage and Culture Foundation. I'm also the Utah Chapter President of the Afro American Historical and Genealogical Society, as well as Charter Board member of the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. This presentation is about Sema Hadithi African American Heritage and Culture Foundation, discovering, preserving, and telling the stories of African Americans in Utah. I want to thank the Utah Division of Archives and Record Services for inviting Sema Hadithi Foundation to tell the story of our foundation during its annual Family History Day. The Hadithi Foundation was founded on the need to tell a fuller story of the Black experience in Utah. Sema Hadithi is Swahili for tell the story. We not only want families to learn the stories of their family, but to share the stories with everyone. Sema's History Initiative brings together the efforts of a number of organizations, including the state of Utah. We hope the state will be a key part of the collection and archiving of artifacts and digital support, as well as ongoing exhibits. Our initiative brings together partners such as Utah African American Historical and Genealogical Society, Better Days, Preservation Strategy, the University of Utah, Brigham City Museum, Union Station Museums, Fort Douglas Military Museum, Mormon History Association, and a diverse team of educators and researchers. This presentation will cover some of the experiences my wife, Alice, and I had as we operated the only Black Historical Genealogical Society in Utah. It will address three main things: discovering the need, addressing the need, and building a team to help organize the foundation and tell the stories of Black families in Utah. First, discovering the need. Helping individuals with their family stories has introduced us to some amazing stories. There is the false belief that there is no Black history in Utah. These experiences has helped us to discover these needs and beliefs. Sema Hadithi Foundation came about out of the need to tell these stories. I will also talk about addressing the need. The larger part of what we do is putting down the false belief. We want to talk about the importance of Black history in Utah, and we do that through community conversations and through public events. The ultimate thing I would like to discuss is building a team. I personally had to make that final commitment to a history foundation. And we had to face the fact we needed to gather allies, and that happened over time. We had to figure out how to bring those allies together who were committed allies and plugging in experienced professionals and independent researchers.
What drives my activism is history, because we have to remember the past, because we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. So it is important for us to remember our history, and we have to be able to move forward. We also have to exist in the present day, and then even sometimes looking backwards, and we look backwards to see some of the things that has happened in the past so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Be able to be present in the moment, but also move forward in the future as better people in this space together. That is what drives my activism. As a writer, it is important to me to get the stories correct and to speak accurately about the characters that I'm writing about. And you can always tell, at least myself as a writer, I can tell when I'm not getting their stories correct because I can't write it. And if I can't write it, that means I have something wrong. I am not listening to them tell me what their stories are. And I think as a writer, the most important thing as a writer is to be accurate in the stories that you are telling. And it may not be a comfortable story. It may be very uncomfortable to write it and even to read it. But as a writer, your most important job is to at least be honest about what you're writing about. And that is the same way that I approach everything that I do, in making sure that I tell it from an honest perspective. And because if you're not honest, the readers will know. They will know. And when my characters, I have to write my characters as honest as I possibly can. And I always say that I can hear my characters speaking to me, and they're telling me their story. And my job is to write it. I'm the medium that the characters are using to tell their story. It's not my story, it's their story. And my job is to accurately tell it. So that's what I try to do as a writer, is to make sure that I tell that story as accurately and as honestly as I can. And sometimes it's not even comfortable. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable to tell a particular story, but it's important also to do it right, and also to do it honestly. Sema Hadithi tells the story, and through my activism, I tell the historical perspective of the moment and how we got here, because it is important to understand how we got here. When the summer of 2020, when many people took to the streets and marched after the murder of George Floyd, for some people that was the first time they had ever marched or protested anything in their lives. And for other people, people who are like my father's age and people like the late John Lewis, for them, it cultivated and it spoke to the history of the civil rights movement and brought back home for them and the feeling of marching through the streets for civil rights during the 50s and the 60s. And I remember watching a segment about the late John Lewis when he was actually marching with the Black Lives Matter marchers and protesters right before he passed away. He went down to what in Washington, D.C., it was the Black Lives Matter Plaza at the time. And he had to go down there. And he spoke about how, for him, that moment felt so different than even what it did in the 1960s and when he walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. And what he talked about is the reason for him why it felt different, because he said it was more multi-generational and multicultural. And it was being led by young people all over the world. And that moment felt different for him. But it was so important to bring in the history of the movement so that we could really truly understand and appreciate that moment in the summer of 2020 when people are marching in the streets and marching in protesting things that have been protested for 50 years, 100 years. The things that were being said were not new, even though it was new to a lot of people. In that moment, and the movement was new, and it was a new generation of people. But it wasn't a new fight. It wasn't a new argument. It wasn't new. But it was also needed to be told, and it needed to be done. And when you just bring all of that together, and you study what the John Lewis did, what the Martin Luther King Jr. did, and what the CT, I forget his name, we can talk that. CT Vivian, that's his name. What the John Lewis marched for, and what Martin Luther King marched for. And everyone that marched across from the Edmund Pettus Bridge to Montgomery, even across Washington, D.C., what they were marching for. And the summer of 2020, it wasn't just the United States. It wasn't people just marching for George Floyd in the United States. They had images of black and white people and our Arab brothers and sisters from all over the world. I'm sorry. That was marching and was saying, Black Lives Matter. Because we have a history in this country when black lives didn't matter. When black bodies were hanging from poles and trees. And in 2020 was dying under the knee of a law enforcement officer. And it spoke to people in such a way, the same thing as Bloody Sunday. When you think about the civil rights movement and what moved, especially white America, to really take part of the civil rights movement and to say something needs to be done now, it was what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Because that was the time of television, and people were just getting television in their homes. And they saw, many for the first time, what black Americans have been saying about their interactions with law enforcement just for the right to vote. Just for the right to vote. That's what the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge was about. And then in 2020, you had a black man who had an interaction with law enforcement and was killed under his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And Americans and people all over the world watched a man die, and right in front of their face on their television. It harkened back to what happened in Selma in 1965. That's why that was so powerful. That's why it touched the heart and soul of people all over the world. And that's why they took to the streets. That's why we can never forget the past. We can never forget the past. We must teach the past. We must teach history. We must tell the story and tell it accurately. Because that's how we stand and exist in the moment that we are right now. And that's how we move forward as better people. That's how we get there together.
My wife Alice and I discovered the need as we operated the Historical and Genealogical Society, Utah OGS. OGS is an acronym for Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. It is a membership organization that is largely, but not limited to, African Americans. It was founded in 1977 in Washington, D.C. to support the research and preservation of Black history in the United States. We discovered the need in a number of ways. As we helped families with family history research, we were discovering stories of Black people. As we attended conferences and conventions like RootsTech, LDS families were coming up to us about discovering slaves in their families, understanding through national conferences that history provided context to family history. As we have done our work over time, we have discovered, unfortunately, this false belief. This false belief happens for several reasons. There is the belief that there is no Black history in Utah, especially in pre-settlement time. Most of us have only been taught about Latter-day Saints settlement. Black history, particularly pre-settlement history, has not been taught. Another great problem is that there is no ongoing academic concentration of research or study of Utah Black stories. As families are doing their personal story, the work is not being shared with the broader community. Over time, we began to recognize that we needed to create a permanent institution. We needed to move more from event storytelling to fixed storytelling. We needed to move from sensational attention to permanent presence. And our mission was to build a concentration of knowledge of Utah Black history through research, preservation, and indeed storytelling, or Hadithi.
What brought me to the museum was just the love of the collections that we have here. It's a really great opportunity to work with history, natural history, and art all in one great place. Becoming a director of a museum is an interesting journey. I think everybody is different. I started out interning at the Jewish Museum in Manhattan while I was an undergrad at Sarah Lawrence College. I traveled, then my next internship was in Colorado, and then I started a job in more administration and curation in Virginia, then moved to Alaska, back to Pennsylvania, and finally in Utah, which is where I've settled. The work I do here at the museum as museum director is I'm responsible for all of the operations, the collections, art history and natural history, programming, and our exhibits schedule. The most exciting thing about working in museums is just getting to really immerse yourself in the community, both the past and the present, through the collections, through the art, and through the programming, getting people through the doors. I got introduced to Sema Hadithi through Robert and Alice. I attended a Zoom lecture that they gave early on in the pandemic about genealogy specific to African American history, and I just felt like I really wanted to reach out to them. So slowly over the course of time, I just started working with them more and more closely, and next thing I knew, they had gotten me involved in the board of directors. What I think is most important about Sema Hadithi's work is just how foundational it's going to be for future researchers and exhibit programmers. Creating a unified source and bringing together the experts that they have to do the research and create the resource materials is going to fundamentally change the way that Black history is done in Utah. I think young people would be very interested in the work that we do. I think it presents a much more well-rounded view of history, which also creates a more rounded view of our present. And I think that younger generations are really tapped into wanting to learn about that kind of thing.
When confronted with the belief that people had about no Black history in Utah, we tried to address it immediately. We told people the stories that we knew. When we pointed people to resources like blackpast.org, Better Days 2020, and Century of Black Mormons. We didn't just try to address the problem immediately about talking about Black history. We tried to create opportunities to tell the story by having things like community conversations where we discuss race and religion, and also created public events like conferences and special presentations, doing a day of remembrance and holding an annual History Conference. One of the more proactive ways we found to speak to this false belief of no Black history in Utah is speaking at other organizations' events when we're invited, like Family Search, the Mormon History Association, the Genealogical Society of Hispanic America, the NAME Conference, and speaking to other genealogical organizations like Albuquerque Genealogical Society. One of the critical things that we wanted to address in telling the story of African Americans in Utah is try to understand why is Black history so important in Utah. And one of the bigger reasons is that we recognize we were losing talented people because of there was no view of inclusiveness in Utah. Black professionals found the environment in Utah hostile. Blacks, especially visitors and transients, couldn't find connection in the history of Utah. And this connection is critically important for children who look around them and don't see adult representation, leadership, and decision makers that look like them. So let's look at this idea of connection a little bit closer. People are held together through a shared narrative of a cohesive community. And in the Black community, there was no overarching Black narrative. And this shared narrative created the cohesiveness, and it did it in several different ways. This could be a traditional community from home outside of Utah. It could be a shared cultural that's unique to a new Utah community. Or most Black people may tolerate or mirror a white culture with few fully assimilating that culture. So there is this created duplicity of cultural duplicity because people who did not want to assimilate the culture in the new area that they lived in. Here in Utah, unlike many other states, there is a very strong overarching, narrow, and exclusive narrative. However, there are a number of initiatives to expand the storytelling of Utah among Native nations, African Americans, Hispanic neighbors, other Chinese, and other immigrants.
I think it's crucial that we support the work of Sema Hadithi because we need to do a better job of telling Black history, both in Utah or whether it's Mormon history or Utah history. Those are stories that aren't told enough, and they're important stories, and we can't really understand all of our history unless we understand Black history. They're an important part of our collective history. I've been involved in community service in terms of history for many years. History is very important to me, and it's important to me to foster other younger historians and historical groups who are striving to share their stories with the broader community. I think in so doing, we strengthen our communities when we understand and know each other's stories. It's important that we understand our history so that we understand people who are different from us, so that we understand all aspects of our history, so that we can have compassion for others and an understanding of people with different viewpoints than our own. And this leads to a sense of community and helps us be able to strengthen our communities when we can understand where we've been, how that affects where we are today, and how we can make a better future. And if you don't have an understanding of history and everyone's history, you can make the same mistakes of the past. So I chose to write my master's thesis on Japanese American internment policy. And in writing that, I studied the history of racism in the United States and how that our history of racism has shaped who we are. It's not only who we are, it's not the only thing that has shaped us, but it is something that is in our past that we need to reckon with. And I think organizations that are willing to bring to light maybe some things that make us uncomfortable about our past, for example, lynchings in Utah. Sometimes it's hard to learn about those things because that can be a shameful history for us. But it's important to understand them, again, so we do not repeat mistakes of the past, and so we can come together to make a better community for all of us. I think too often communities of color are forgotten as we talk about history or as we talk about public policy, so on and so forth. And so I think, again, by studying history of all peoples, sometimes those whose history isn't spoken about as much, we can become more aware of other people and understand everyone's history, which makes history more vibrant and more exciting, more interesting, and again, helps us understand people who are different from us so that we can make a better community for all of us, not just one majority group. I think again, I'm always going to come back to history as a historian, but I think that getting involved studying history, again, is a great touch point for knowing where you want to go from there. So because of my study of racism, the history of racism in America and Japanese American internment policy, that led me to want to be an activist in these areas because I've seen the mistakes we've made in the past, mistakes we continue to make today, and I want to be an activist in making a change because of my understanding of history. So I think that's a great place to get started, and then just find the things that you're passionate about, the things that matter to you, where you want to make a difference, and reach out. There are all kinds of people willing to include you in their causes.
Sema Hadithi, or to tell the story, is surrounded by the idea of unity through historical truth. And we do that by sharing a lot of the great stories that we've discovered, like the police officer in central Utah that was passing for Native American, boarding house owners in Korean, black women's societies, the great many stories of Buffalo soldiers, black business on Ogden 25th Street, railroad workers, Emancipation Day celebrations, black enclaves, and black women auxiliary corps that served out at Wendover that we recently discovered, and many other stories like these that have not yet been told. After all of these years of work, it became apparent that ultimately we need to get to the place of where we could build a team to help tell the stories of African Americans in Utah. But making that final commitment to History Foundation wasn't necessarily something I personally wanted to do. In other words, I needed to be convinced. And my wife, Alice, talked with me on a number of occasions about creating a Utah Black History organization. I just wasn't convinced that it should be us to do it. It became inevitable because we were already spending a lot of time talking about Black history in Utah anyway. So it was more for me then to have to grapple with the idea of changing from the focus from a national body, which was AHS, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, to a small unknown body with no recognition, meaning Sema Hadithi, that was created right here in West Valley City, and having to go back 6 years and reproduce the effort it took to make the broader community aware of AHS. One distinct advantage, however, folk already knew us, so it wasn't completely starting from scratch. As we begin to think about this idea of building a team for a historical organization, as we discuss the needs over time of the community and how we would go about finding allies. Uh, we served in the community and we became aware of the depth of need for a cohesive community narrative, other than a disdain for Latter-day Saints. There's a strong and continued sense of us against them that didn't include strong historical context of us. This is due to the long history of racial and religious contention. Alice and I decided to have the focus be more about the internal community and less about the external contentions. We felt it was better to try to establish a sense of shared success in building the community by sharing historical successes. Now, there has been some challenges. A lot of people that feel that an idea is important, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily ready and willing to help do the work. We have the ongoing hurdle of plugging into people we need. And one of the ways we did over the years is as we've met people, they were now asking us to help them by participating in their programs. And it took a long time to plug into a field of experienced professionals and independence. We also had to find or plug into organizations in related arenas of genealogy, history, research, and event production. We feel like we now have partners who are committed and think what we are doing is important. And they are part of this belief in historical truth. We can't build cohesive communities if the stories of our community are based on ignorance, lies, distortion, and folklore. And we want to work with partners to create a community of unity through historical truth, honesty and truth, and cultural acceptance, respect of heritage, and the fostering of safe spaces to share. We are so appreciative of our great sponsors who have supported us and believed in us, like the Utah Department of Heritage and Arts, who has supported our community events, the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at BYU, who has supported the Equal Justice Initiative project on lynching of Black men in Utah, Preservation Strategies, who have not only donated but has given time and effort in helping us organize, and our great friends at the Silver Foundation. I want to introduce you to some of our great community supporters, like Betty Sawyer. Betty supported us in everything. In Utah, being Black and LDS can be difficult. Betty accepted us from the start. She gave us space to learn and grow. W. Paul Reeves has plugged us into the larger history community of Utah and helped us to establish its presence through the Mormon History Association, as well as Barbara Jones Brown, pretty much like Betty, has supported us in all that we do. And Juan Becerra helped us gain access to venues and resources for our events and invited us to other important events. He would literally contact and say, "You need to attend this."
Sema Hadithi's mission is to create and tell an inclusive story of Utah history, inclusive of stories that sometimes are neglected or left out altogether. So as a Utah historian, I fully support Sema Hadithi's mission a mission designed to tell an inclusive vision of what Utah history has meant. I'm a historian of the American West, of Utah history, and as a result, Latter-day Saints play a big role in the story of the American West as well as in Utah history. So for as long as I've been a Utah historian, I've been also a historian of the Mormon past or Latter-day Saint history. I've been at the University of Utah since 2005, so this is my 16th year, and Latter-day Saints have always played a role in the way that I approach the story of the American West as well as the story of Utah history. My hope for the work that I do for Century of Black Mormons, the work that I do with Sema Hadithi, is that the public becomes aware of some of the forgotten voices and forgotten stories of Utah history, that we start to think of Utah as a meeting and mixing ground for diverse groups of people who come together to share this space we call Utah. They bring different meanings, different ideas, different understandings, and that in meeting people from the past who might be different from us, we come to arrive at a more inclusive vision of what Utah history can mean in the present. 3 Black enslaved men were among the first to arrive in the Salt Lake Valley. They were a part of Orson Pratt's Advance Company. They arrived July 22nd, 1847, 2 days in advance of Brigham Young. They're already plowing and planting the ground by the time Brigham Young arrives. So 3 Black Latter-day Saints, Oscar Crosby Smith, Harkley Wells, and Green Flake enter the valley as a part of Orson Pratt's Advance Company. Over 20 wagons, 40 men, and they camp around present-day 1700 South and 500 East in the Salt Lake Valley, which becomes known as the first encampment. But it's important to recognize then that Utah history includes Black enslavement from the very beginning. And that's also a part of the story. They were pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley, and the Latter-day Saint settlement in and of itself then also begins the displacement of Native American peoples. That's also a part of the story of Euro-American settlement in the valley. So it's important to be inclusive in terms of the stories we tell, and that's a part of my vision of Utah history, also a part of Sema Hadithi's vision for trying to be inclusive in the stories that it tells. The most exciting thing about this work, I think, is people who might not identify with Utah history finding ancestors that look like them or people that look like them in Utah history. They find their stories as a part of the Utah past, so that no longer is it just someone else's story, but it becomes theirs. And when those lights go on, that's what's really exciting for me. Just the ability for people to see themselves in the past.
Quickly, I want to introduce you to the great team of people who make Sema Hadithi work. We have been really blessed to find these folks. Even more blessed that they are willing to get in there and help us get this work done. We are fortunate to have great leadership. Serving on the executive committee with myself is Alana Blumenthal. She's our director of institutional development, and she's also the director of Brigham City Museum. And serving with us is Kirk Huffaker. He's our managing director. He also was the former director of Preservation Utah and is currently operating preservation strategies. Completing our board directors, we have Alice Birch. She's our director of special events, and she operates Ask Mama Alice. And we have Bernard Silver in compliance and business development, and he operates along with his wife the Silver Foundation. Doug Meissner, he's our state liaison, and he works in library and collections coordinator for the Utah Division of State History. and Elizabeth Horror. She's our state coordinator. She's a public archaeologist and Utah State, out of the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Our teams are set up in what we call working groups. One of our great working groups is the Buffalo Soldiers Working Group. They're led by Elizabeth Horror, uh, along with Fiona Robinson, Riley Jensen, plus the consultation of Dwayne Margie and Jared Birch on our graphic novel project. Now, the Buffalo Soldiers have served at Fort Duchesne, Fort Douglas, Inverness, and around other parts of the Uinta Basin. The Black Women Working Group works on personal histories of prominent Black women in Utah all the way back to the 1800s. They're led by Tiffany Green, and also on that team is Rachel Quist, Adrian Scott Ellis, and Sophia Wife. They worked on great projects like the Emancipation Queens and Emancipation Celebrations, social clubs, and support for Black women, and the Women Auxiliary Corps of the United States Army at Wendover, and other projects that they've done excellent work on. The only permanent working group is the Preservation Working Group. They primarily focus on preserving historical buildings, landmarks, artifacts, and other places that are relevant to the Black community. That team is led by Kurt Huffaker, along with Dr. W. Paul Reeves, Dr. James Tabery, and myself. The big project right now is a community project to commemorate lynching of Black men in Utah. This is governed by the guidance of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. The Salt Lake County Community Remembrance Coalition springs directly out of that effort. The coalition directive is to create opportunities to discuss equal justice, social justice, and economic equity. While lynching are considered extrajudicial or outside the legal order of arrest and trial, there are many social issues that help create an environment of inequity and inequality that allow mob justice to exist. Because of this, we plan community discussions around due process under the law and provide historic context. The Black Church Working Group is working hard to discover the names, locations, and leadership of existing and now defunct churches around Utah. Their team leader is Jared Birch, and on that team is Artist Partial and Adelaide Dresden Crapo. Our newest project to launch is Pre-Settlement and Settlement Era Utah, and that effort is underway by Emily Peck Crumpton. And the primary focus will be the collecting of names of explorers, location of slaves, and free settlers before and during the Mormon settlement of the Utah Territory. Our other team members include Andrew Holmes, Barbara Jones Brown, Holly Andrew, who actually operates the Utah Station Museums and looking at starting a number of new projects, and A. Jerome Christoph. And here's a list of future projects in working groups that will cover topics like arts and blacks in business. Ben's 25th with Holly Andrew, the Pullman Porters also with Holly, civil rights, educators and academics, public health and safety, black enclaves around Utah, political leaders, and criminal justice. And we have two community projects underway. One of them I've already mentioned to you, Salt Lake County Community Remembrance Project, led by the Salt Lake County Community Remembrance Coalition. And it is a group of community partners. They're representatives of Betty Sawyer with Ogden NAACP, Reverend Oscar T. Moses from Calvary Missionary Baptist Church, Sean Newell from the Utah Multicultural Civic Council, Barbara Jones from the Mormon History Association, James Tabry from the University of Utah, Jerome Christoph of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and myself representing Semi Hadithi Foundation. And we are the representatives to the national organization of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. The second community project that we are involved in is the Genesis Group 50th Anniversary Historical Retrospective. And our partners in that effort is Alice Birch at Ask Mama Alice, Taryn Mitchell of the Black History Museum Bus, and Cleopatra Balfour at Utah Arts Alliance. Sema Hadithi Foundation was founded on the need to tell a fuller story of the Black experience in Utah. And in my presentation today, we talk about how we discovered the need to tell the story of Black history in Utah, what we did to begin to address the need, putting together a committed team, and some of the projects and working groups that we have going on now and planned for the future. We also talked about some of the community projects that we have going on. Our hope is to tell a fuller story of the families, communities, organization, and history-making events of the Black people of Utah. Allow me again to say thank you to the Utah Division of Archives and Record Services for inviting me to tell the story of Sema Hadithi Foundation. I am happy to answer any questions about the organization or help you on your quest for greater knowledge of your family and our family, which is all of Utah. And if you would like to participate in the efforts of one of our working groups, please contact us. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization, so consider donating to one of your favorite projects. Take care, and remember to always Sema Hadithi, that is, tell the story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Lee. I'm happy to talk to you today about the various resources we have in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections here at BYU that may be helpful to people doing family history research. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are located on the first floor of the Harold B. Lee Library on the BYU campus, just one floor below the Family History Library. Just go all the way down the stairs in the library atrium, and we're right there. We almost always have a fun and interesting and hopefully educational exhibit there to greet you in our lobby before you make your way to our reception desk and reading room. Just like most special collections at various institutions, our collections include a hodgepodge of materials that are rare, unique, or otherwise have historic value. Here are a list of our major collecting areas. But today, I'll be focusing on the collections and resources we have that may be of interest to people doing family history or genealogical research in the state of Utah. While there may be some resources in the other areas, the collecting areas that have most of the family history resources can be found in our collections related to Mormonism, Utah, and the West, and our photograph collections, most of which are also related to Mormonism, Utah, and the West. Based on this, you can probably suspect, and accurately so, that our collections will be most pertinent to people who have ancestors that are or were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and or lived in Utah or the American West. but you'd be surprised what you'd find. And maybe some of the things I share today will apply to any who are viewing this presentation. The focus of my presentation will be on things in special collections you can find online. Now, that doesn't mean that everything has been digitized, not even close. Sometimes you may just find a description of something we have, but most of these items you'll be able to request a copy of for your personal use. And often you will be given permission to share them on Family Search or your personal blogs, or however you want to distribute them. But I'll get to that at the end of my presentation and provide more information on how and when to get permission and our policies for posting these items elsewhere. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 main online collections that are great tools for locating family history resources here in the Elton Perry Special Collections. These include a database of descriptions of diaries or journals, letters, histories, and other manuscripts, a digital collection of many of our photographs that contain images of people and places from early Utah, and a digital collection of a selection of Mormon missionary diaries, which is also full text searchable. During this presentation, I'll provide some tips on how best to use each of these resources in your family history research. I'll conclude with some general tips in searching the rest of our collections and other general information about special collections. The Elton Perry Special Collections houses over 12,000 manuscript collections ranging from hundreds of boxes to 1 letter. These collections include handwritten diaries or journals, letters, photographs, histories, or other unpublished materials documenting the lives of many people. Most of these 12,000 collections are part of the Mormonism Utah and the America West collection area, spanning from the 19th to the 21st century. The vast majority of them can be searched in our department's Finding Aid database. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term Finding Aid, I'm including definitions of the term provided by the Society of American Archivists. But basically, a finding aid is a description of the item or collection that makes it discoverable, providing information such as title, scope, and content. Biographical historical notes, creators or collectors of the materials, and subjects. Some descriptions of larger collections include descriptions of the series, which is just another name for a grouping, a folder, or even item levels, but this is not always the case. These descriptions take a lot of resources to create, so we do what we can to keep up with the ever-growing amount of collections we have. We do receive new items from generous donors or through purchase nearly every day, and we are doing what we can to make sure everyone knows what we have. Not that I'm trying to make excuses, but there are logistical reasons why we haven't described every single item in our collections, and every other archive or special collections is dealing with the same issue. But we feel pretty good knowing that the vast majority of our collections are at least described in some way, and therefore people can hopefully find them. Okay, now that we've covered definitions, and I've made my little disclaimer about the limitations of our descriptions, and we're ready to go to the database. The web address to the Finding Aid database is archives.lib.byu.edu. If you type this into a web browser and hit enter, it should take you to this web page. From here, you have several options. You can type in a name or place in the search box and then just see what you get. Hits are relatively precise. However, it should be noted that this search engine searches the title, description, biographical history, and subject terms. Sometimes biographical histories include names of people or places that don't actually relate to the item being described. Your results list may include both names of people, organizations, places, and subjects, along with titles of items and collections. Clicking on one of these names will get you a results list of all collections connected to that particular name. Or, if you want, you can filter down to just collections by clicking on Archival Record or Collection under the record type in the list of additional filters on the right-hand side of the screen. Archival Record includes items that are part of a larger collection, described down to the file or item level. These are indicated with the paper icon and green text in your results lists. Collection will bring back results of whole collections related to that term, which could be anywhere from, as described earlier, one item or folder to dozens or hundreds of boxes. Individual collections are indicated with the box icon and red text. And not every collection has been described down to the file or item level. Actually, most haven't. So I would try both of these options to get the best and most inclusive results. Now you can search by more than just keyword, including title, creator, subject, notes fields, and identifier or call number, as well as by date span. However, I tend to find the best results by just searching by keyword. Once you've found the collection you're looking for, click on the title or call number to get that collection's finding aid. Here, you will see detailed information about the collection and, if applicable and available, an inventory of the collection. For an example, let's do a search for Newell Kimball Whitney papers. This is the results list if I type that in to our search box. You'll notice that the results aren't perfect. And the exact match for the collection title shows up as number 4. But at least it was one of the top 5, right? Anyway, if you click on the title, it will take you to the page like this. Here you see more details about the collection as a whole. And at the right is a list of the series or groupings that make up the collection. To navigate through the finding aid, just click on a series. If the finding aid has been described down to either the subseries, file, or item level, it will take you to a list of those below, that appear below. And in this case, there are subseries or additional groupings below the series. And if the finding aid has been described down to the file or item level, it will take you to a list of subseries or files or items that, and if the finding has been described down to the file or item level, it will take you to a list of items that appear below, like this. You can click on the title of the item. And if the item has been digitized, a thumbnail of the first page or a cover of the item will appear above the description. Clicking on that will take you to the digital copy. Now, just a reminder, this is an example of a collection that has been described at the item level and has been digitized. Most of our collections are not yet digitized, and most are not described at the file or item level. But this gives a basic idea on how to navigate our finding aid database. If you're interested in seeing these items in person, you can come to our library and see them in our reading room. None of our items circulate. If you do have a question about a particular item, you're welcome to contact our reference desk who can help you or put you in touch with the appropriate curator if needed. And contact information for the department reference desk and all staff can be found on the Lee Library website at this address, lib.byu.edu/directory/special-collections. Okay, now let's explore our digital photograph collections. Many of the photographs housed in Perry Special Collections, although again, not all of them, have been digitized and are available online. We have images collected by individuals and families and some of well-known photographers of early Utah, like C.R. Savage and George Edward Anderson. Most of these contain images of people and places from early Utah. Today, I'll show you a few tips on how to search for specific names and places in some of our online digital collections that are outside the manuscript finding aid database we just went through. First step is to go to the library website at lib.byu.edu. The homepage should look something like this. From here, click on the green collections box. It will take you to a page that looks like this. The first step, From here, you'll need to scroll down to find the digital collections link just under special collections, all the way at the bottom of the page. Now click on digital collections, the digital collections link shown here, and you should see a page that looks like this. Well, this is a good place to start for searching what we have digitized. Can't guarantee it has everything we have digitized, but it will have a lot of it. From here, you have basically two options. You can either scroll down the list of collections and find a specific collection to search in, which we have nearly 100, if not more. Or you can just type in the search bar a name of a person or place that you want to search and see what we have digitized related to that name. This will search across all digitized collections. And I'll be aware that digitized collections include multiple formats, including photographs, journals, letters, and some publications, including newspapers. So let me just use an example to search for just photographs. If you type in the search box the name of my hometown, Payson, Utah, and hit enter, you should get a results list like this one. Search results will have relevant research guides and tools at the top that you can see there in that kind of pinkish box, followed by the list of items that match your results or match your search. I got 802 results, but the first is a newspaper article. Now, if I wanted to filter down to just photographs, I can go to the filters that are on the left-hand side of the screen. And then first, just click on resource type. This will open up a list of different format types that are currently in the list of results. If I just check photographs, like this, the list automatically filters down to just those 90 photographs. And the number in parentheses is the number of items that match that specific resource type. I can then scroll this list and see what is available. Now, if you scroll down a little bit further, you'll notice some portraits. Many of the images in the George Edward Anderson collection are from his studio in Springville, Utah, where he photographed people from all over the state. So if you have an ancestor who lived in Utah around the late 19th century, early 20th century, I would recommend trying to search by their name and see what happens. For an example, let's use my wife's maiden name, Jarvis. I found better results when I just used the last name instead of a full name. Usually the results lists aren't terribly large once you narrow it down to photographs. Now, when I search for Jarvis, then filter the format to photographs as I did previously, I just get 5 results of people with Jarvis in their name, plus 3 results with Jarvis in the description of the photograph somewhere. You'll notice in the results list that most photographs of people are from the George Edward Anderson collection, as the first 2 on this list are. So if you're really looking for people, you could just go to that collection and search in there. This would save you the step of limiting to photographs, but would not catch any photographs that may be in one of our other collections like C.R. Savage or, like is shown here, the Huntington Bagley collection. On the third item, you'll notice that it came from the Huntington Bagley collection. But in reality, the Anderson and Savage collections are the 2 main digital collections that have photographs of people. So I'd recommend searching both of them just in case. I should also note that there are many photographs embedded in our manuscript collections. So if you strike out here, you may want to look in the manuscript finding database as well. Now, a third online resource we have available that is useful for genealogical research is our Mormon Missionary Diaries database. Now, at first you may think that this will only be useful if my ancestors' missionary diaries in this collection. However, this database is full text searchable. So if your ancestor was even mentioned in someone's diary, maybe the missionary who taught them or who associated with them in some way while serving a mission, you may find them here. Now here's how you do it. The easiest way to access this website is by going directly to this address, lib.byu.edu/collections/Mormon-missionary-diaries. It's also accessible on the digital collection site we went to earlier in the browse list. Just scroll down to item number 67. However you get there. Once you're at the page that looks like this, just type the name of an ancestor in the search box. You can also search by place name to see if one of the missionaries served in the same city your ancestor may be from. So let's use just one of my ancestors as an example of how to use this database. Joseph Birch. If you just type in his name first, no quotation marks or other symbols, This should be your results list. You get 5 hits. That just means there are 5 different volumes that have matches in them with the names Joseph and or Birch. So unfortunately, this is not 100% accurate. So if I actually search through the William Ajax diaries, which I've done to see what matches there might be, I don't find any entries with both Joseph and Birch together. They are mostly just entries with Joseph. There are some entries for Birch, but knowing my family history, I know that Joseph Birch was born in England and joined the church with his family in about 1838. But they migrated to Utah in 1855 and was there until he served a mission to Europe in 1873. So these Ajax diaries would not include anything from him since they date from the 1860s. However, again, knowing my family history a little, I know that Joseph Birch's family was taught by William Clayton in the late 1830s in England. One of the diaries on my list is William Clayton's Missionary Diary from 1840 to 1842. Now, since Joseph and his family were still in England at the time, there is a chance that he may mention Joseph Birch or his parents or family. And Joseph was only about 13 or 14 when he was baptized in 1838. To find out if he or his family is mentioned in the diary, I click on the thumbnail image or title of the diary. Then you'll see something like this. It should take you to the first page in that volume of the diary where there are matches to the names you're searching for. The terms searched for are being matched with the transcription of the page, which is viewable by scrolling down until you see the text box below the image of the page. The words you search for should be highlighted like they are here. Just a quick note, most of the diaries in the Mormon Missionary Diaries database have been transcribed. However, if you find a diary outside this database, it may not yet be transcribed, although we are in the process of getting many of our digitized documents transcribed. Anyway, I'm not 100% sure if this is my ancestor. It could be another Joseph Birch. However, I'm just excited I found a match, that possibly William Clayton, the missionary who taught my ancestor, mentioned him in his diary. Now, my first search was for both first and last name. It's possible that William Clayton mentions people only by last name or may abbreviate their first name. So to kind of make sure you get all of those included in your search, you could do another search for just last name without even leaving the site. Just go back to the top of the results list and change the text in the search box to just Birch or whatever your last name might be. This time, I get 7 results. You'll notice the pages in the results with the red bar next to them are the ones with the matches in the search term. The default setting is to show in the results list the pages of all the diaries and just mark the ones that match the search in by red. But you could filter by clicking on this filtered button here. It will filter the list down to just the pages with matches to the search terms if you want to do it that way. And then you can browse each page that has a match. If I do that, I'll see that most of these entries are for a sister Birch, not Joseph. And often, sister Birch is indicated by just the letters S-I-S before the last name. And this may be my ancestor's mom or sister. Anyway, those are the basic instructions for searching this database for names mentioned in diaries. I know it's kind of technical and requires a lot of steps. It's not perfect, but hopefully it made sense, and maybe you'll be lucky and find some of your ancestors mentioned if you give it a try. You can really enrich your collections of sources for your family histories. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'd talk a little bit about policies for requesting copies. For the most part, you will be able to get a copy of items in our collections, but be aware that there are some potential reasons why we won't be able to make copies. This includes items that are fragile or in too poor condition to copy, items that are restricted by the donor or for having confidential or sacred information, items that include personal information such as social security numbers or other personal identification numbers, and possibly addresses and phone numbers of people still living, and things that are still under copyright. If someone is requesting a whole collection, a copy of a whole collection, although this one will depend on the collection and is usually at the discretion of the curator. Curators of photographs and film collections usually require their approval for making copies for their collections. But I just suggest making the request, and then we'll handle determining if we can copy it or not. We'll let you know if there are any issues. So feel free to just make a request. There are fees. There are some fees involved with copies, just like anywhere else. But our fees, in my opinion, at least, are pretty minimal compared to some special collections and archives, and are mostly there just to pay for the cost of supplies and labor involved. Our usual fees for copy requests are 25 cents a page or $30 a folder, whichever is cheapest. Photocopies may include a shipping fee, so normally we default to digital scans unless you really want the physical copies. Digital scans are usually sent to you by email with a link to a folder and box, with 14 days to download it. Once you have the images, you can put them on disks and drives as much as you want and share them with families and friends, as long as it is only for personal use and not being sold at cost. But to make requests, the best option is to contact the Special Collections Reference Desk directly, either by email or phone. If the item is already online, you're free to download a copy for personal use. What is available is usually low to medium resolution. So to get a high resolution copy, you'll have to request that through us. And if you plan to publish anything from our collections, this will require additional permissions, forms, and fees. So please contact us early on about this if this is your intent, so this can be taken care of as soon as possible. And once you find something in our collections, one of your instincts will be to share it with your family. And we want to help with that as much as possible. Most of these items are meant to be shared, so as many people as possible can have access to them. So if you get a digital copy of something you find, or find something you want to share on Family Search or a family blog, or wherever, we just ask you to do two things. First, ask for permission. While most items are okay to post, we always like to make sure before giving permission. We also like to know what is being posted and see how our items are being used. Second, we ask that you attribute the item properly to Elton Perry Special Collections. This is important so people can know where the original of this item can be found, and if they want to cite it in a paper or publication or wherever else. You can use the call number, which can be helpful in locating the original, but it should be noted that these do, on very rare occasions, change. To conclude, I just want to show you some basic tips for searching the BYU Library website for family history resources. Now, along with diaries, letters, and photographs, which I covered today, we also have thousands of biographies, autobiographies, and family histories that may not be included in the databases previously mentioned. To find these, you can do a general search in the library's catalog. To do this, just go to the library website at lib.byu.edu and type in an ancestor's name. And since we often use full names when known, I would recommend typing in the full name. You can tell if the objects are in special collections by looking under Collection at the left. And clicking on Collection will open a list of all the library collections with items in the results list. Scroll down to Special Collections, and you'll see in the parentheses how many items are in the special collections that match your result or match your search. Clicking on the checkbox will filter the results list to just things in special collections. So go to the library website, explore our collections. Once you find what you're looking for, just click on the title for more information. And if you want to come see the item in person, write down the title and call number, come visit us. Again, we're on the first floor of the Lee Library at BYU. Here are our hours and contact information. And you can even follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for fun highlights from our collection and information on special events and exhibits. We hope to see you soon. Thank you for your time. And hopefully what I shared today will be of use to someone doing some family history research out there. And happy Archives Month.
Good morning, and welcome to this Utah State Archives and Record Service session for Family History Day 2021. My name is Jim Kitchis, and I am the Assistant Director of the Utah State Archives and Record Service. It is my pleasure to welcome you and to take a few minutes outlining where we will be taking this presentation today. Next. Today, we are pleased to present Insights from a Life, Engaging with Records to Trace Your Family History. In this session, my fellow archivists from the Utah Division of Archives and Record Service will share research methods and insights on how to find people in your family history. Drawing on examples from the Mormon pioneer experience, as well as the U.S. immigrant experience, we will highlight a variety of archival records, collections, and institutions, and demonstrate how to utilize these resources in discovering your ancestors in time and place. Our goal today is to show you how to use archival records, the conversations within an archive, if you will, to do your family history research. We will discuss processes and methods for conducting your family history research by drawing on examples provided by two very different historical figures. We will share insights on the different types of records and archival collections that have proven to be of high value to genealogists, and we will provide specific information on the various repositories and online spaces where these high value collections can be accessed. It is now my pleasure to introduce the archivists who will be taking us on this research adventure this morning. First up, we'll have Gina Strack. Gina has been at the Utah State Archives since 2002. She's the Digital Archives Manager and a Processing Archivist. She is a certified archivist and has an MLIS from the University of Washington and holds a certificate as a Digital Archive Specialist. After Gina, we'll hear from Mahala Rudell. Mahala is an archivist at the Utah Division of Archives and Record Service, where she primarily works with local government records. She also serves as Executive Secretary for the Utah State Historical Records Advisory Board. She has a Master's of Arts in History from the University of New Hampshire. And after Mahala, we'll hear from Heidi Stringham. Heidi has been at the archives since 2008. She is the Research Center Manager for the archives, and she holds an MLS from Texas Women's University and a Genealogy certificate from the Salt Lake Community College. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Gina.
Thank you for the opportunity to profile one person in multiple sources and repositories. Benjamin Landon, or B.L. Doty, was born in 1835 in northeastern Pennsylvania. He joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and immigrated apparently on his own, not with a wagon train or other church members, sometime around 1855. He married Mary Jane Hoffines in 1856. After 8 children, they separated or divorced in the early 1870s and each remarried. While together, they lived in Salt Lake City and Bingham Canyon, among other places in Salt Lake County. Doty moved to Cache County and married a widow, Mary Jane Butterfield Whittle, in 1874 and settled their blended family in Richmond. Doty served as a local judge before dying in 1896. He is also my 3rd great-grandfather. I've been chasing him through records for about 7 years now in an ongoing conversation between us. Speaking of conversations, dear ancestor, I may not have found you today, but it's a 3-day weekend and I bought snacks. In reviewing past research on Doty and trying out a few new avenues, I've ended up with at least several different repositories: the Utah State Archives, the Utah Division of State History, the LDS Church History Library, the Family History Library, Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum, plus additional sources made available online through sites such as FamilySearch.org and Ancestry.com. That's a lot of footprint for one 19th century individual. While it helps that he lived in the latter half of that century after the Civil War and increased record keeping, one thing that really drives this availability is that he is a white man. I know from experience that even the white women in his life are much harder to find in the records. Plus, in the context of Utah history, he is considered a Mormon pioneer with his arrival in Utah between 1847 and 1869, further driving efforts to document his life within this group. As I mentioned, Doty was born in Pennsylvania and immigrated to the Utah Territory sometime in the early 1850s. He was a young single man whose father, Ellis Doty, had left the family when his son was only a few years old. His mother moved back in with her parents and, after filing for divorce, remarried. We know his birth date and place from multiple sources, some listed here. Several are contemporary to his lifetime, and others are recorded afterwards. A patriarchal blessing is a ritual of the LDS Church that usually contains the birth date, place, and name of one's parents at the beginning of a text about future potential in life. It remains one of the only sources that lists Doty's father's name, a particularly elusive person. In 1850, when Doty was about 21, he's a resident of Pennsylvania, according to the US Census, but would next appear out west in Utah. It's unclear whether Doty joined the church before or after coming to Utah, but we know he was around in 1855 when a news article in the Deseret News reports him missing, presumed killed by Indians. Missing, a young man named Benjamin L. Doty left the house of Mr. O.E. Bates in Tooele County on the 4th instance for Benson's Canyon, where he had been making shingles, since when he has not been heard from. This notice was published on November 21st. We don't know when he showed up again or what explanation was given, but we do know now where he was in November 1855. This small item provides additional clues for research. Who is O.E. Bates, and can we confirm his relationship to Doty? A day laborer? Maybe not so much, but neighbors? Living as a boarder? Where in Tooele County is Benson's Canyon? Is that related to Benson's gristmill? And finally, Indians camped in the canyon at the time are mentioned. Can we identify a tribe or group that could be living in this area? What was their relationship to other settlers that might lead to an assumption that they would kill a white man that hadn't been seen by those white settlers for a time? Asking these types of questions lets one delve into available sources to form a fuller picture of a person's life. Similarly, the next year, there's a very small marriage notice in the newspaper that provides the bride's name and the fact that the officiating for the marriage between Doty and Mary Jane was Brigham Young, president of the church and also territorial governor. In this city, December 1st, by President Brigham Young, Mr. Benjamin L. Doty, and Miss Mary Jane Hoffines, all of this city. Doty is now married and living in Salt Lake City as a member of the LDS Church. Between 1858 and 1869, he and Mary Jane would have 8 children, with 2 or 3 dying young. In 1870, the family of 8 was then living in Bingham Canyon, which had opened up recently to gold, silver, and lead mining operations. According to his daughter's history written later, Doty engaged in mining and keeping store part of the time. And also about this time, and in Bingham Canyon, we have a letter from Doty to President Brigham Young. Before we get into the letter's contents, I'll share how I found it. Doty separated from his wife about the same time. We don't know when, as the histories written for the family, written like his daughter, do not contain exact dates. Their youngest child was born in 1869, and he remarries in 1874. After exhausting available territorial court records, I started looking for any sources that would be available from his membership in the LDS Church. The Church History Library provides access to records created by the church organization, plus some historical records like those kept by Brigham Young for both his personal and business matters. I learned that Young had kept business records for members in his role as church president. I submitted a reference request and received a response that while the divorce record for Doty was not found, his name was located as indexed in correspondence, and then a copy of this letter from 1872 was provided. Doty wrote to President Young on January 3rd, "Dear Sir, Thinking that perhaps the slightest proof might be precious in the upcoming trials, I write to you to inform you that there is a woman here that will testify that she heard Bill Hickman tell Marshall Gibbs that all he wanted to live for was to get revenge on President Young. If you wish to know the party, please answer this. Yours in the gospel, B.L. Doty. Whether or not you recognize the name Bill Hickman, we definitely do not have the time to get into that part of history here. Suffice to say, Hickman had a long association with Brigham Young, but through a series of events in the late 1860s, they became estranged to the point of Hickman cooperating with anti-Mormon forces in exchange for avoiding jail for murder. You truly never know where family history research will take you. So working in the state archives with some reference experience in locating divorce records for other people, my first research with Doty and his family was actually the presumed divorce in the early 1870s. I have yet to locate a record though, due to either the records not surviving or possibly never being created. People in those days could move away and start a new life without the kind of formal and legal records we are used to today. After all, his own mother had petitioned for divorce without a response from her now former husband. The law at the time allowed the divorce to happen anyway for the all too common reason of desertion. What's interesting about two other sources found within personal papers at the Division of State History is how a family story can change over time. In 1939, Doty's second youngest daughter reported originally in her own hand and later typed and copied, saying, "Some misunderstanding arose between father and mother. I cannot think of it in any other way, as both seemed above reproach." A generation later, his granddaughter would write in her history, when his wife died and left him with 5 children, he was sore perplexed as to what to do. While we do have reports of his first wife dying in 1878, we also know from his daughter's history that the children actually moved informally between the parents in that time period, often interrupting their education, something she seemed to regret. In 1874, Doty married a widow who had been on her own for a few years up in Cache County after her husband died in a building accident. Together, they blended their family with several children, now older and getting ready for adulthood themselves, plus 2 new babies. This family doesn't seem to have had much financial security, living in rented houses while Doty tried a variety of different occupations. His granddaughter recalls that anyone in the farming community of Richmond who was not a farmer wouldn't be found in the upper circles of that society. Some of the work he tried included running a sawmill and opening an ice cream parlor. He eventually studied the law and was elected a city judge in Richmond. Richmond is a small town in Cache County. In 1872, it had a population of barely over 1,000 people, but the first local government started just a few years earlier. Interestingly, Doty's second wife's first husband, Thomas Whittle, was on that first city council, but he died within the year, leaving his wife a widow and the office vacant. By 1891, Doty is mentioned in a newspaper notice as a city councilman himself. I don't yet know when he was elected to this municipal office. Shortly after, in January 1892, he started appearing in local news items concerning the organization and meetings of the Richmond Democratic Club. The term Democratic Club is important to note and unique to Utah. Before this decade in the history of Utah Territory, political parties did not align with the National Democratic and Republican parties. Instead, it was a religious alignment with Mormons in the People's Party and everyone else, sometimes called Gentiles, in the Liberal Party. This changed in 1890 with the official banning of polygamy by the LDS Church and a movement toward the political mainstream. So that is why the newspaper coverage would say something like, "Reports from all parts of the county are of the most flattering and satisfactory character. There never has been any doubt of the success of the democracy here. And now that both parties are getting their principles before the people, democracy is gaining ground with surprising rapidity. When the county held its convention for that election year, Doty was on the Central Committee, continuing to advocate for candidates on the Democratic Party ticket. In 1893, he was installed on the ticket as a justice, probably meaning a justice of the peace. As reported in the newspaper, the candidates are exceptionally strong and will pull the full strength of the vote. There's easily much more research that could be done on Doty as a local government official. For example, he may be mentioned by name in city council minutes, or there may even survive a justice record book for his work as a justice. These types of records may be found in state archives, manuscript collections, or still in the present day city offices. In the winter of 1896, at 60 years old, Doty became ill with pneumonia. He died January 15th, and a few days later, the event was noted in the newspaper that his death will be regretted by hundreds of friends. In another local item 6 months later, the correspondent reported that he had missed that old Democrat. The old warhorse left a sign behind. It's painted in large red capital letters on the north side of his house: free trade and sailors' rights. As it turns out, that message is from way back in the War of 1812, especially for the sailor rights part. The free trade phrase is likely related to the intense debate on tariffs in those closing decades of the 19th century. What do we conclude from tracing the life of B.L. Doty? As a white Mormon pioneer, we can find him in vital records, correspondence with other men, and in leadership positions in a small community where he eventually settled at the top of Utah. Despite the instabilities of changing jobs and renting houses and multiple marriages, he stepped up to serve in various municipal offices and advocated for joining one of the national political parties. His lifetime stretched across most of the 19th century and between Pennsylvania in the east and Utah in the west. Here's to a few more 3-day weekends, with snacks, of course, to shine a light into all the corners of the life of Benjamin Landon Doty.
Thanks, Gina. That was really interesting. So as Jim mentioned, my name is Mahala Riddell, and I'm going to take us through some insights gleaned from the life of Sarah Nathan Pomerantz and Salt Lake City's Jewish community. And yes, there is a Jewish community in Salt Lake. Next slide. I first encountered Sarah when browsing the Jewish Oral History Project, which is a collection of oral histories gathered by the American West Center in the 1970s that document the lives of Utah's Jewish community. Sarah caught my eye because of her colorful and very personal descriptions of growing up in Salt Lake and her candor about what it was like to be a Jew in a city best known for its LDS population. Next, please. I'm going to spend some time in this presentation talking about all the various sources through which we can learn about Sarah and the Jewish community, but I want to start first with a brief summary of who she was in order to set up some context. Sarah was born to Ida and Moses Nathan in Rechitza in April 1888. Rechitza was in what was then the Russian Empire and what is now Belarus. Her father immigrated to the US in 1889, shortly after her birth. Several years later, Sarah, her oldest sister, and her mother followed and joined Moses in Utah in 1893. From that point on, Sarah lived in Salt Lake City. She grew up very proud of her Jewish identity and as observant as she could be in Salt Lake City, given the resources. She and her family were founding members of one of Salt Lake's early synagogues, Congregation Montefiore. The congregation was formed in the 1890s, and the synagogue, which is pictured on this slide, was built in 1903. Sarah married Saul Pomerantz, also a Russian Jewish immigrant, in 1919, and the two had children. They lived and worked in Salt Lake City for the rest of their lives, and Sarah passed away in 1981 at 93 years old. So what can we learn from Sarah's life? Asking ourselves this question can help us figure out what sources to look for. First, because we know Sarah was born in Russia, we can learn about the immigration process. Rekhitsa was once one of the largest Jewish communities in Belarus. At the time Sarah and her family immigrated, the Jewish community made up 67% of the population as a whole. On the eve of World War II, there were more than 7,500 Jews living there. Today, there are almost none left. Because we know Sarah immigrated as a child, her naturalization would have been dependent on her father. With that in mind, we can search for Moses Nathan's records. Sarah's citizenship was complicated by a series of immigration legislation in 1906, 1907, and 1922, which tied the citizenship status of women to that of their husbands. Sarah married in 1919 when her husband Saul was not yet naturalized. Because of this, she would have lost her citizenship. Saul did naturalize in 1924, but this was after a 1922 legislative change untangling women's status from her husband, so technically Sarah would still have needed to naturalize again herself. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a record of that, but I do have a record of Sarah being issued a Social Security number in the 1950s. So we can assume that either she did renaturalize and we just haven't found the records, or perhaps that the court waived the issue because her marriage and citizenship status was changing right in the same window of time that the law was. Next. From Sarah's oral history, we can learn about the Jewish community of Salt Lake. Sarah talks a lot about the early community, from the availability of kosher meat to the observance of Jewish holidays. Salt Lake City's Jewish community is actually quite old. The first Jews moved here and established businesses in the 1850s. The first synagogue was built in the 1880s, but only lasted about 5 years. It fell apart over bitter disagreements over levels of observance. Shortly after it dissolved, the community split religiously into Reform and Traditional, with a Reform synagogue, B'nai Israel, built in the 1890s, and a traditional synagogue, Montefiore, built in 1903. An interesting, if brief, story that Sarah relates in her oral history is regarding the founding of a second Orthodox synagogue in Salt Lake, known as Shari Tzedek. The community was made up of mostly Eastern European Jews who were dissatisfied with the levels of observance at Montefiore. Unfortunately, not much more is known about this community, other than that it was around for only about 10 years before being absorbed back into Montefiore. Sarah's father's headstone here reflects just how involved she and her family were in Jewish religious life. The Hebrew on the headstone reads, "Our dear father and public servant, one of the founders of Congregation Montefiore." Next. We can also learn a little about Salt Lake society from Sarah's history. Searching for her in historical newspapers turns up numerous snippets about various civic groups that she was a part of, as well as social occasions that she hosted or took part in, including one pictured here simply noted to be a miscellaneous shower. And next. Lastly, we can even learn about Salt Lake's business community. Sarah herself worked as a sales lady at several establishments in town. Her husband, Saul, owned and operated 2 clothing shops. And Sarah even talks about walking to synagogue on Saturdays and holidays and feeling such a sense of pride in seeing Jewish-owned businesses with signs in the windows noting their closure for the holidays. Pictured here on this slide are 3 Jewish businesses, Auerbach's, Cohn's, and Bamberger's, all mercantiles here in town. And oral histories, while subjective, contain excellent information. I've put up 2 pages on this slide that demonstrate what you can find beyond just stories, from biographical details to specific locations. For instance, when Sarah notes here that she lived with her family on West Temple below 900 South, an area of town that she notes as being sparsely populated at the time, even though we might think of it today as Central Salt Lake. Next. So what's next? When using a source like this, ask yourself questions about the information that you're given and where you can take it to learn more. For instance, because we read that Sarah was born in Rachica, we know that we can look for naturalization records. Addresses and location details can lead us to historical maps, and the names of businesses can take us to photograph collections and city directories. Census records are always a good place to start, of course. They can be accessed through the National Archives and Ancestry.com, but keep in mind that many local libraries can help too if you don't have an Ancestry subscription. This here is the 1900 census showing Sarah and her parents and siblings in Salt Lake. We can also get naturalization and occupation information from these kinds of records, which can then lead us further. Next slide. For instance, to the Utah State Archives and the collection of naturalization records that we have, including this Declaration of Intention for Sarah's father Moses from 1893, and on the next slide, one for Sarah's husband Saul from 1921. Beyond these records, newspapers are often treasure troves of information. On this slide is an example of a fun article about a play put on by the children of Congregation Montefiore to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Purim. Sarah, who would have been about 11 at the time, was playing the role of second maid of honor. Her sister Esther was playing Tarshish. On the next slide, we see an example of a newspaper article announcing Sarah's marriage to Saul Pomerantz. It is actually fun to kind of cross-reference this record with her oral history, because in her oral history, Sarah mentions that she was married in a small ceremony at the synagogue, but that her mother made a very big deal about it at home, making sure to throw a huge party and invite everyone that they knew. On the next slide, here's an example of using multiple unrelated sources to flesh out Sarah's story even further. In her oral history, Sarah mentions that prior to her marriage, she was a sales lady at a hat shop. Because she gives the name Banks Millinery, I was able to comb the newspapers further and found an advertisement for the store. The ad very helpfully provides an actual address, 116 South Main Street. With that info, I turned to the historical photos collection at Utah State History, searching by street name. I found this image of a streetcar strike in the 19-teens. And while that's fascinating in and of itself, what's also interesting is that we see building numbers on the businesses in the background, including where the red arrow is pointing at 116S, or the Banks Millinery. Last slide. Now, all of this just barely touches the surface of what's out there to find. Resources I used for these slides include collections at the University of Utah, the Utah State Archives, the Utah State History, and the collection of historical newspapers at Utah Digital Newspapers. I hope I've helped start some wheels turning for your own family history research journeys. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Heidi now so that she can give us some more information about some of the resources Gina and I have both mentioned, as well as a little overview of what we've got at the State Archives.
Thanks, Mahala. Now that my colleagues, Jim, Gina, and Mahala have spoken about tracing an ancestor through multiple repositories, I would like to turn your attention back to the archives. I would like to show you how you can search for records on the archives website, archives.utah.gov. Next. When starting your search at the archives website, archives.utah.gov, you will click or hover over the research records icon. This icon gives you the option of clicking on research guides, indexes, exhibits, digital archives, inventories, and lastly, agency histories. Next. I will focus on 3 of the most important links for finding records on our website: research guides, indexes, and digital archives. We'll start with indexes. There are currently 74 indexes available to search. Next, we will move to research guides. These guides are grouped by topic: vital records such as marriage and birth and death records, court records, land records, law and legislation, military, mining, and other records. Research guides can help you to focus your research on certain types of records. Under the different types of guides, you will find a list of record series. A record series are records of the same kind or purpose. Next. When a record series is processed for access, the processor creates a finding aid inventory. The finding aid/inventories help researchers locate or narrow down the exact reels of microfilm or boxes containing the records they seek. The archives currently has over 3,000 finding aids inventories available on our website to help researchers locate the information they need. Next. The digital archives is a great place to begin your research. The records in the digital archives are some of our more popular items. They include brand books, birth and death certificates, court indexes, and other records of historical value. Next. Digitalnewspapers.org was used extensively by our researchers. This project started by the University of Utah in 2001, and then expanding to include other universities and colleges in Utah, is digitizing Utah-centric newspapers. There are currently 3.5 million pages from nearly 200 newspapers available. The contact information for repositories featured in today's presentation can be found at the Utah Manuscripts Association website. The UMA also offers additional resources. Next. While the Research Center is closed to walk-ins, the Archives reference staff is available for reference services. We are conducting research by appointment in the Archives building, and we are just an email or phone call away. Here is the Research Center contact information. I hope that you now have a deeper understanding of what other repositories in the archives have to help genealogists. Thank you for joining us today at our Family History Day event.